Sources APA stuff. Yeah, they'll be due tonight. I have a couple of you. Doesn't bother me. 11:59. All right, with me. All right, so we have left off talking about the reasons to not franchise. And as I said before, I was kind of laughing that if anybody, Starbucks is giving lessons about expanding too quickly. But you know, Dwight Schultz can do what he wishes. But no, there are logical reasons why you may not necessarily want to franchise, and if you fall into that area, it's fine. The franchising is interesting because I was reading there are 890,000 different franchises in the United States. Okay. Europe has always thought franchises were in. Now they are into franchising as well. It just solves a lot of issues, especially when you're talking about conflict, the transfer of intellectual property. It does do things in a very valuable way. So as far as we know, franchising is going to continue and it's going to be successful for a lot longer. So what are, by strategies, what this part is going to talk about is how do organizations, franchisors, and franchisees make a happy relationship together, somewhat happy. All right. Because realize this for the franchisee, they're willingly giving an enormous amount of power over to the franchisor. So there has to be some kind of reasonable transfer that makes this kind of arrangement successful. And so we're going to talk about the physical makeup of franchises. You know, how do we come about agreements? So we're going to also talk about the why parts a little bit more. And so in strategies, we'll talk about whether we're going to buy half of a piece of pie or we're going to buy the whole piece. And let's start by talking about the strategies. There's basically two strategies, and we'll talk about these in a couple of separate slides. There are the product and trade name franchising strategies, and then there are the business format franchising strategies, and then we'll actually have company-owned stores. So without lingering too long on this slide, let's go to talk about product and trade name franchising strategies. So, if you go to Mr. Tire allows you to buy Dunlop, Goodyear, Goodrich, Michelin, and a couple of others. I personally choose Custom Muffler, which is down the hill. Dr. Reitman is very complimentary of them. He grew up in this town. His children went to App State. He knows this. He trusts Custom Muffler. I do as well. And so that's where I buy them. But they're also a Michelin dealer. So it kind of seems like it violates the rules of what a franchise is, but not necessarily so. Custom Muffler is a franchise store. So is Mr. Tire. They sell the same brands. They don't have exclusivity in that area. Well, the reason why is that these are franchise systems, but they're product and trade name strategies. The franchisor authorizes the dealer to sell their product line, and use their trade name in promotion. And that is effectively as far as it goes. You can tell a product or trade name franchise because usually they stand out with their own name. This is their place where there is not a deliberate loss of identity. Product and trade name franchises generally deal with very idiosyncratic specialties. Truck stops, tires, furniture. Where the franchisor makes their money is on the sale of the goods at a wholesale price. And so when I go to Custom Muffler and I buy my Michelin tires there, Custom Muffler makes their money off of the difference between the wholesale and the retail price. Michelin makes their money when Custom Muffler buys those tires from them. And so that's how you keep the peace. Being unique, tires is a very special thing. It requires unique skill sets from the individuals that are in that store. They can be supplemented with technical information that Michelin, Goodyear, and Goodrich, and Toyo, and all of the other tire manufacturers, but ultimately the experience and the skill rests with the individuals who are putting the tires on. Authorization can be at a retail and a wholesale level, which is kind of unique. So in essence, there aren't just franchisors and franchisees. It means a corporation such as Moody Price becomes an authorized reseller of Baldwin and Wix filters. And so they can sell off brand. At the wholesale level, usually you can find drink bottlers and distributors. Generally, the way that works is Coca-Cola or any of the breweries license the process that they do in order to make their particular goods, and they're shipped to the wholesalers. So you will see like Gulf Coast Bottlers, North Carolina Bottlers, all of those are unique organizations. They are authorized to brand their merchandise, but in essence, it's not in the exact franchise level. And so product and trade name franchises, usually large, unique, idiosyncratic abilities, something that is particular to those areas, and they make their money off of selling margins to the dealers. The difference is, of course, is because of the less intimate nature, they can't demand category exclusivity. And that usually is done because of the unique services that each organization, Mr. Tire, has their unique ways of working versus the way that Custom Muffler does. Now, the one that we're all talking about, the one that is predominant is what's known as the business format franchise. The business format franchise, if I were to ask a question on a test and it would be an essay question, the answer for a business format franchise is the licensing of an entire way of doing business under a given brand name. Where in a product and trade name franchise, the franchisor makes money on the margins of the goods they sell. For the franchisor in a business format franchise, it is the generation of ongoing fees from the franchisees. Not only do they get the goods authorized with their brand name downstream, but also the industrial and intellectual property rights of those particular items. This is the Faustian bargain that the franchisee gets for their pound of flesh in terms of their independence. And so there are three features that a business format franchise has. It is the use of a common name or a sign. brand. Franchisee accepts that and removes themselves as independent organizations in the business in terms of visibility. There is a pipeline of communication know-how from the franchisor to the franchisee that helps the franchisee achieve success. And when we talk about channels as being a process and not an event, this is certainly one of them because it is a continuing provision of commercial and technical assistance. Because the state is constantly evolving, the experience that they have is evolving as well. And so when COVID came in, the most immediate effect was, how do we get goods to people? It led for several years, organizations being forced to close their lobbies and sell directly through their drive-through windows. Chick-fil-A got so good at it that almost 75% of everything they sell is now through the drive-through window. And that expertise was passed from the franchisors, for the ones who first saw it, down to the franchisees that were going to see it. And so this is where a business format franchise ultimately creates its greatest success. And so these are the two franchising strategies that are out there. There's also the company store. We'll be talking about the company store in a bit. So how do you get this willing combination between organizations? How do you get everything to work? Well, the answer is you don't go down with a handshake deal, all right? Because, who was it? Sam Golden once said, a verbal contract isn't worth the paper it's written. It requires contracts. Franchising, the requirements from each side are governed by contracts. And there are three major things that contracts in franchising covers. One is, how do they get paid? And guess what? The franchisee doesn't get paid. Well, they do, but you have to pay the franchisor first. The next is the real estate. And how do we make decisions with that? And the third is, when everything goes sideways, how do we terminate in a way that lets both parties survive? And it happens. You know, one of the amazing things, is just off the topic, is, you know, the 4-lane highway down 321. Does anybody ever remember that as a 2-lane? No, I remember it as a 2-lane. 3 companies went bankrupt trying to build that highway. All right. Yeah. I mean, and yet it still got built. It took a lot of effort to be able to find companies that could build a road on solid granite, and they were able to. But I just thought of that off the top of my head. Sometimes it takes a will, and they did it. So franchising, back to business. So how do you get paid? So the franchisor, that's the big question. How do they get their money? Every franchise starts with what's called a franchise fee. And that's the sunk cost. A sunk cost, by definition, is a cost that you can never recover. And let me give you a word of advice. Never make a choice because of a sunk cost. Just because you spent money on something, if you have to bail, get out, okay? At some point, a sunk cost will sink you if you spend too much time thinking about it. So the initial investment, the franchise fee, is an amount of money that you put down in order to achieve a franchise. It can be as little as $500 for Pampered Chef. It could be as much as $1 million for McDonald's. And if you've got $1 million, why do you want a McDonald's? I don't know. And the actual truth is that when you put your foot down on franchise fees, many times they'll pick it up and they'll make it, well, maybe 700,000 or whatever. So, you know, this can be flexible, but then again, it comes to what the point is setting a hard target. So the first thing is the sunk cost. You pay that in order to be able to have the franchise. One of the reasons that Subway grew to 28,000 different locations in the United States is that Subway's franchise fees were really low. They were anywhere between $12,000 and $18,000 a franchise. It meant that mom and pop convenience stores could buy a Subway, and as long as they provided the kitchen and did all of the right things, they could have a franchise. And that's why Subway grew as fast as it did. The next is the royalties on sales. It's called royalties because it is the money that is skimmed off the top of your monthly income, not at net income. Excuse me, let me say sales. It is a percentage of sales. Let me make you use the right term. A royalty is a percentage of sales every month. So when there were computer store franchises like Intercom and some of the others, Entree computer stores, the royalty fees were 9%, which meant that if you did $500,000 in sales in a month, not income, but just sales, before you paid your first bill, you did an automatic draft to Entree for $45,000. That's what a royalty means. Before you even pay the light bill, you pay your franchise fee first. And so those are the ones that you see on every franchise, all right? Some are less than others. It all depends on the strength of the franchise. Now, if I'm a franchisor and I need to grow, I need to put together as many places I possibly can as fast as I can, I might forego my upfront fee in favor of royalty payments later on. This is called an opportunistic holdup because I'm taking the risk that the franchisees will accept that existence and may accept a slightly higher royalty fee. So it's the franchisor that's making a risk because perhaps the reason is they want to grow fast rather than grow big, all right? So the important thing about their organization is they've got to hit the ground running and hit the ground fast. 24-hour fitness locations are a great example of that. So 24-hour fitness, by its very definition, are places where you can badge in, go to exercise at 3 a.m. in the morning and badge out. For them, putting as many locations as in strip malls and mini malls was so important that they were willing to hold down their royalty fees, or excuse me, their sunk costs. And so they did that and they grew exponentially because once again, it's a good idea, but how hard is it to copy if you have the equipment and the leases? It's not that hard. And so that's an example. The last is tied sales, and this is what every franchisor does. Every month, or let's just say almost every week and even every day, the franchisee buys the inputs or specific supplies from the franchisor. And so like every other day or so, you'll see an 18-wheeler roll up to McDonald's and they will unload their goods. And that constant tied sales generates an enormous amount of income for McDonald's. It is a wonderful advantages for the franchisor, and it is reasonable advantages for the franchisees. Once again, you consolidate, put together all of those until something goes wrong. Now, Subway about 5 years ago had a genius idea. The franchisors, because they weren't making quite enough money, they decided, well, instead of doing deliveries every day to our franchisees, we'll do them once a week. So what happens to lettuce and tomatoes? They're just sitting there. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Now, this is one of those great examples when conflict came around, the franchisees erupted, went back to Subway and showed them in the contracts where they're supposed to come every day. And Subway found the error of their ways and they went back to every day. But my God, it was, wilted lettuce. So these are the 4 ways in which franchisors get money. Real estate. So I'll talk about this a little bit. There is no more difficult thing for a franchisee to have than having land that they may not necessarily want, except if you're my friend Bobby Hughes or Robert, excuse me, Bobby. And you got about $168 million in property now. Usually franchisors hold the right to lease the property to the franchisee. It makes the franchisor's termination much more credible. If I'm a franchisor and I can say, I own the land, you got to get off, then the contracts are much more viable. Leasing negotiation requires experts. If any of you get into businesses like this, the most expensive thing is an inexpensive lawyer. Franchisors do act as landlords. They can assist them. They can reduce their capital requirements. And if they are not abiding by their contracts, they can evict them. And they can keep the site by the franchisee. Now, many ones like McDonald's make you build your own franchise location. And there are pieces in the contract in which you will be compensated for that property, but it certainly isn't going to compensate for the time and effort it took to build it. And so, once again, a Faustian bargain. The last is term no franchise. No franchise wants their franchisees to go out. Losing a franchisee can be very difficult. It can make it expensive. And to find a replacement, that can be even more difficult. So usually the franchisor will impose a transfer fee to cover the costs if they have to find a replacement on their own. Now, if a franchisee is going out, usually contractually, they can find someone to replace them. But what most franchisors do is they put in a clause known as the right of first refusal. So the right of first refusal says, we will accept who you think, or we'll match that offer and take it over ourselves. So what would be reasons for termination? Well, reasons for termination generally come into violations of the contracts. So what are the violations of the contract? Buying from unauthorized suppliers, failing to meet deadlines and obligations, refusal to pay royalty fees, failure to meet standard codes of operation wherever they are. You can't have dirty places. And if you're shut down by the Board of Health, you've got a lot more problems besides dirty floors. So, somewhere in the contract, they're writing something that has to do with termination. If you're lucky, it never comes along. Usually, by the way, contracts are long-term in nature, anywhere from 10 to 15 years with renegotiations in them as well. So the contracts do not act in perpetuity because things change, but they're in a reasonable long-term frame so that the franchisee does not feel threatened if there's some kind of change, okay? So what are the three parts of contracts? This is also, if any of you take contracts, by the way, if you go into industrial organizational psychology or any of the other management functions, contracting is an extremely important, valuable thing, all right? You may not want to get into it as a lawyer, but you need to understand contracts. I have signed too many contracts that I didn't understand the fine print, and I was wrong every time I did it. So don't make my mistake. So what are the three parts of a contract? A contract has to be consistent. You need to have a single contract with a single price for all franchises, and that is non-negotiable. It's on a take it or leave it basis. And the reason why is equity theory. You want to be able to treat franchisees in an equitable manner. Now, you can have clauses in them that talk about sizes. In other words, if you have more than one franchise, but that's another negotiated point. As I said, contracts do not generally vary over time. They have the advantages of, especially over years. Well, if you imagine McDonald's has been around since the 50s, then it kind of gives you an idea that they've plowed through this ground many, many times and know what to look for. They are enforceable. And so they safeguard the relationship. And a lot of that has to do with weighing the cost and benefits of punishing each other. In other words, non-compliance is not tolerated. Now, truth is, if there's a few violations, do they let them go? Yeah, I mean, they do. Because nobody wants to enforce a contract. It's the last straw, all right? When I start talking about power, and I talk about reward power and punishment, you'll get an idea of what I mean. The last is that contracts are self-enforcing. In other words, you arrange the incentives to ensure that cheating is not in your best interest. You get substantial breaks on wholesale prices when you come to them as the supplier. You cannot get those breaks in the open market. There's a willful need for cooperation together, and that's built within the contracts. That's what self-enforcing means. It means you don't have to sway. You can stay the track and you can continue on in a generally successful manner. And so all contract, I would even say any contract would probably have all these things built into it. I would not be surprised. Now, the problem is that every time you balance power, you create the possibility for imbalance. And this is one of those difficulties with law, all right? So does anybody know what an NIL license means? NIL. It's in sports. Name, image, and likeness. Okay? So, for decades, the NCAA has allowed universities to use the faces of their particular students in their promotion material. The difficulty with that is that those students have not been compensated adequately for that. The NCAA could have solved this decades ago, but they didn't. They dragged it out, and it finally went to court. And when you go to court, guess what happens? It's winner take all. And so athletes 2 years ago got the right to be able to advertise their own names, images, and likeness. And so now we've opened up a whole new Pandora's box. And you know what? I give all the athletes all the credit. You young people, if they're using your image, you deserve every penny. All right. But we're talking about now, we've got individuals who are making $5.5 million, not from playing, for being on a football field. And that's an entirely different can of worms. And this is the difficulty when it comes to some of these particular items, is this creation of balance has now created a possibility of imbalance, because smaller universities cannot possibly compensate their athletes for the amount of money, let's say, a USC or an Alabama could. So this is one of those things, you know, no good deed ever goes unpunished. Okay. Company stores. There are stores that franchisors will open. So why would a franchisor open its own store in a given location? So I used to live in a little area called Columbia, Mississippi. Columbia has about 7,500 people living in the city itself. But during the middle of the day, it swells to as big as Boone, about 20,000. It's a county seat. It's in Marion County. Okay. Columbia is known as where Walter Payton came from. Anyways, they wanted to be able to put a Wendy's in Columbia. But the problem is that quite simply, there was no one there who had the deep enough pockets to be able to open a franchise store. And so what they did was they ultimately created a company store there. And so these are what company stores are. About 30% of all franchise locations in the United States are company-owned stores. There are many times when franchisees have to bail that the franchisor will take those over and they will run them themselves. They do this for several reasons. One of them is to recover brand equity. The other is that these stores become laboratories. They become great locations to put trainees in, to learn about their businesses. This is one of those things that Wendy's, Dave Thomas was a brilliant guy. He came up with this strategy, and it's so successful. It allows you to take your organizations, have your top people learn the franchise business, and then ultimately they can spin off and they can become franchisees themselves. You can go and put goods that you need to experiment with, that you want to see if there's actually a viable market for, you can put them in these company stores and you can more closely monitor them to see how successful they can be. You can start as franchisors once you build the models, then you can turn them into franchisees. And so if I'm a franchisor and I want to test the model and I have some ideas and I'm just trying to grow, but I don't know what it would be like if I'm to go out in the cruel, cold world and see whether this is going to work or not, I can start a franchise, a company store, learn the business, and then I can turn it into a franchise store. And so they work well. Do they grow as fast? No, because once again, it's like it's a company store, all right? By favoring franchisees over company stores, you grow faster. But there are very viable reasons why you do it. And you want to make sure and you do it again and again, and it works excellent. It works well. So you maintain company stores and franchise stores, and they perform the same functions. You create career paths for personnel. You can move them back and forth between the company side and the franchise side. And there's a complementary, a synergistic work together because both the franchisors and the franchisees benefit. Let's say you've got some franchisees and they started out and it's pretty rough and they're not sure how to work. Well, what you can do is the franchisee can take one of their assistant managers, let him go into a company store, learn the ropes in a much more controlled environment, see where the failures are happening, and take that knowledge and bring it back to the franchisee. It's great. It works. So company stores have reasons, they have purposes for being in business, they do good jobs. You can't grow fast having every store in a company store, otherwise, I mean, it's not a franchise then, is it? All right. You might like running company outlets, gives you, a greater feel about what the success is. You reduce your performance ambiguity because you understand what's going on downstream, but ultimately success in the franchise system is investing in the franchise system. And that's the way it should be, okay? All right, I'm running out of voice today, so let's break. Thursday, we'll finish up franchising and we'll talk about the future that is out there.
Thanks. Write the paper.